So now I'd like to start with an imaginative exercise. And I'd like you to imagine that on your walk to work, one morning you notice that a child has fallen into a shallow pond and is struggling to stay afloat. And I take it some of you might be familiar with this one. But the story goes like this. You might dirty your clothes or arrive late to work, but because the pond is shallow, you can easily wade in and come to this child's rescue. So I'd like you to ponder whether or not you'd feel responsible to save the child. By a show of hands, maybe. Who would? Yeah, probably most, if not all of you. And then, so most people say that they would. I'd also now like you to imagine that there's another child across the world in a similar amount of danger, and it's equally within your power to save their life. And would you feel obligated then? You don't have to raise your hands, but I would imagine, like, in scenarios like these, most people would agree that regardless of distance or dissimilarity, if it's in your power to save somebody's life, you probably ought to. I'm going to make a broad and possibly optimistic statement that the nature of altruism is changing. Thanks to advancements in technology, medicine, and economics, we can save more lives with fewer resources and less effort than ever before. But on a less optimistic note, our capacity for altruism goes largely underused. We regularly help family members and friends, but rarely distant strangers, even when we know that strangers are suffering more and we could save more lives by helping them. In other words, human prosociality is relatively insensitive to the consequences of prosocial action, while being surprisingly sensitive to seemingly inconsequential factors like the social and temporal distance of beneficiaries, and how the characteristics of beneficiaries are presented, like their identity and their number. The effective altruism philosophy and social movement, which I imagine some of you are familiar with, prioritizes solving society's most pressing challenges with the most effective solutions. So this philosophy is rooted in the observation that like onlookers by a shallow pond, ordinary people have the power to save lives with minimal costs to themselves. And because people have the power to save lives, they have some level of ethical responsibility to save as many as they can. In greater detail, effective altruists believe that when donating to charity, people should aim to do so effectively by saving the most lives per dollar given. Call this altruistic effectiveness. But the prioritization of effectiveness in altruism demands equity in altruism. So namely, from the perspective of people living in affluent countries who have the most resources to spare, a greater number of lives can be saved not by allocating aid to local beneficiaries, but to distant ones, like the scores of people living in more economically disadvantaged regions of the world, suffering from preventable disease and malnutrition. So the principles of effective altruism might seem pretty easy to endorse in the abstract, but people routinely spend their excess time and money on themselves and close others instead of saving the lives of distant strangers. But effectively addressing global challenges requires prosociality towards the often distant, often faceless multitudes around the world, and sometimes even the to-be-realized generations to come. Precisely the beneficiaries it's hardest to get people to care about. So why do we choose not to save lives, especially distant ones? And if saving lives is something that we deem worthwhile, what psychological capacities can we rely on to allocate resources impartially to those who need them most? So the plan goes like this. I'm going to first talk about some prevailing discourse on how we might be able to overcome limits in prosocial behavior. And then I'm going to integrate some evidence which challenges the prevailing discourse. And then finally, I'll present some new data that hopefully can help reconcile these conflicting perspectives a little bit. At least, maybe a first step. All right. Start off with that prevailing discourse. In contrast to foundational literature in social psychology suggesting that empathy is a primary driver of altruism, there's a more recent perspective that's pervading discourse surrounding the effective altruism movement and a lot of recent psychological theorizing as well. And this perspective is that decisions influenced by empathy and intuition more broadly often yield less effective altruistic outcomes than purely rational or unemotional ones. So consequently, if we want to allocate resources most effectively and most equitably, then maybe we should even downregulate our feelings of empathy when we're deciding to help others. And maybe instead of empathy, we should engage in more deliberative reasoning in order to figure out how to help people most effectively and challenge our intuitions and emotions in these contexts. So why has this perspective emerged? Well, because empathy is parochially biased. People find it easier to feel empathy for close others, in-group members, and one identifiable target over the many. But these pervasive parochial biases in altruism and empathy render all the more remarkable exceptional populations who go to great lengths to help others, like effective altruists who donate a whole bunch of money to really high-impact charities. And also extraordinary altruists who donate organs and other body tissues to anonymous strangers. Now, these two populations, effective altruists, organ donors, they're not the same, but they share a pivotal commonality, and it's that both of these populations don't allow these parochial biases really to influence who they help. Both of them help complete strangers. But despite this commonality, the literature surrounding the mechanisms that underlie these two modalities of altruism have been separate and at times in conflict. So we'll talk a little bit about that conflict. So despite work highlighting these biases in empathy and to focus on reasoning to promote effectiveness in altruism, there's mounting evidence that empathy might not always be a limiting factor and can even drive equitable and effective displays of altruism. So to start out, extraordinary altruists, the people who donate organs to complete strangers, don't downregulate emotionality and heighten ethical reasoning when they're deciding to help others, but rather they show heightened empathic responding to strangers' suffering relative to typical adults. Other extraordinary altruists, people who've pledged to donate a whole bunch of their money to charities, show heightened reasoning skills, but also some heightened empathic abilities as well. Other work finds that biases and empathy vary widely between individuals and tend to be more pronounced in people that have generally socially biased attitudes. So these aren't canonical. They seem to vary. And then a few years ago, my colleagues and I found that people judge equal empathy for everybody as more praiseworthy than biased empathy for close others. So I think collectively, this suggests that real-world equitable altruists show heightened empathic ability, that biases and empathy might not be universal or necessarily inherent to empathy itself, and that people even have like a moral preference for unbiased empathy relative to biased empathy, even if they find it harder to engage in unbiased empathy themselves. So I raised the question of whether empathy is always a source of bias or an obstacle to equitable and effective altruism, or instead could empathy work alongside reasoning to promote equity and effectiveness in altruistic behavior. So now I'm going to talk about some data. And I think it helps to reconcile these debates a little bit on the roles that reasoning and empathy might play in these contexts where we have these trade-offs and we want to do the most good, but maybe we might have like emotional commitments to closer others, and how do we balance those needs? So here's the data that I collected. I recruited a sample of self-identifying effective altruists through the Effective Altruism Forum, Slack channels, and social media. I recruited a sample of living organ donors people who have donated their organs to complete strangers while they're alive. And I recruited a sample of demographically matched controls from Prolific. And these people were all over the world, and they were matched on like a number of demographic characteristics to the special population subjects. And we included a battery of measures to empirically capture the prosociality of these the two special populations and controls. So first on 2 items, we asked participants to estimate the percentage of income that they donate to others in a given year, and also the percentage of their time that they spend volunteering. And in line with our predictions, we found that both effective altruists, who I'll refer to as EAs, and extraordinary altruists, those are the living organ donors, and I'll refer to them as XAs, just for the sake of not saying a lot of words that sound the same. They were more pro-social overall, both in their monetary donations, with effective altruists donating like roughly 15% of their income in a given year to charity. The organ donors, XAs, somewhere around 10, and then like average people were between like 2 and 4. And you see the same pattern with time spent volunteering in a given year. And I think beyond just serving as like a sanity check, these findings confirm the pro-sociality of organ donors beyond just like one profound act of altruism. It seems that these people who have donated a kidney to strangers also seem to like carry over this pro-sociality into other domains of life. They're donating quite a bit more of their income, and they're also spending quite a bit more time volunteering to help others. We also included outcomes that reflect pro-social attitudes in scenarios where equity and effectiveness in altruism intersect. So these metrics assess decisions in these trade-off scenarios that are informed by like real-world dilemmas that are discussed in the context of effective altruism. We're helping most effectively. Saving the greatest number of lives or reducing the greatest amount of suffering also requires helping people who are distant rather than close. And what we find here is that both of the two special populations, effective altruists and organ donors, tend to favor these more impactful distant causes over less impactful closer alternatives. This is both in their moral judgments of other people's altruism and in their own altruistic behaviors in a paradigm where we gave them like real money and we had them allocate in a series of forced choice trials between giving that money to distant others, or rather, sorry, causes that are more impactful versus causes that are less impactful. Both special populations scored higher than controls on measures that capture the prioritization of pro-social equity in isolation. Both effective altruists and the organ donors showed greater impartiality in their pro-social behavior as to whether beneficiaries were socially and geographically distant, such as strangers across the globe, or even temporally distant, like people in future generations. So that's the only future generation stuff we'll talk about today. And then finally, we included 2 metrics that capture this like effectiveness in isolation. On the panel on the left, this was a behavioral donation task. And both of the special populations wound up donating to the more impactful causes, real money, compared to the controls. But for like this explicit attitude of like whether or not we should always choose the more effective, more impactful cause in our altruistic decisions, we see that the effective altruists do endorse that more than controls. The organ donors actually explicitly endorse that less than controls. So this is like the only place where they really deviate in a meaningful way, I think. And I'm like interested in making sense of this. I don't have like obviously a clear answer as to what's going on here, but one possibility is that maybe there's a difference between explicit attitudes such that maybe this is more implicit for organ donors and it's something that happens more intuitively compared to effective altruists who are subscribe to a philosophy that like forces them to or encourages them to deliberatively reason about this stuff, whereas maybe the organ donors just intuitively seem to prefer the impact maximizing causes. So you see it in their behaviors, but not necessarily their explicit attitudes. Interested in going after that further at some point. So to recap briefly, we find that these two populations of real-world altruists respond more altruistically than controls across a host of laboratory metrics that capture pro-social equity, pro-social effectiveness, and pro-sociality more broadly. But I was interested in whether reasoning, empathy, or both predict pro-sociality across the three samples. So replicating the existing findings from the existing literature on organ donors, this population, the population of extraordinary altruists, XAs, the organ donors, scored higher than controls on most measures of empathic ability. So namely, organ donors scored higher on self-reports of empathic concern relative to controls, higher on emotional awareness, and they also scored higher on like reverse-coded measures of psychopathy, where higher scores reflect greater affective ability. Interestingly, though, no significant differences were observed between the effective altruists and controls, which leaves open the possibility that in that population, maybe altruism and equity and effectiveness in altruism in particular might not owe to enrichments in empathy like the donors, but perhaps to reasoning like effective altruists claim that is the case. And confirming perspectives that reasoning does promote effectiveness and equity in altruism. Members of the effective altruism population scored higher than controls on most measures of reasoning ability. So EAs scored higher on need for cognition, which is like the self-stated tendency to enjoy and seek out effortful cognitive endeavors. But also the cognitive reflection test and the heuristics and bias tasks. So on these measures, they're like word problems, and people have to challenge this like intuitive response that comes to mind very easily but is wrong, and engage like deliberative reasoning to get to the correct answer that takes a little bit more time and thoughtful processing. Some people raise that maybe it's just a measure of reasoning ability itself, but that's what these are. And effective altruists scored higher on both of these than controls. Interestingly, organ donors scored higher on the heuristics and bias tasks, but not the cognitive reflection test. I would say that the cognitive reflection test items are trickier, but they're probably easier to solve computationally. Like the most common one is like a bat and a ball together costs $1.10. The dollar costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? The intuitive response is like 10 cents, but that's wrong. The correct answer is 5 cents, because $1.05 is $1 more than 5 cents. So it's not like a tricky math problem, but it has a lore that's really easy to arrive upon first. So I think this does capture to a greater extent your tendency to override that first intuitive response, whereas this might tap more directly into ability to reason, because they're kind of tricky. I don't remember. The problems are much longer, the word problems. So there might be a difference there just in like tendency to engage in intuition or use intuition to guide your responses versus like actual ability to reason. So maybe that explains the difference in the two populations here. Extraordinary altruists, right? They scored similarly to controls on most measures except for that the heuristics and bias task, where they scored similarly to effective altruists. I don't have it pictured here. I also had like a couple of like self-report measures of reasoning ability, and across the board, everybody just thought they were really good at reasoning when you ask them, which like didn't surprise me. So you see the differences come out like in the measures of ability and like how much do you enjoy doing reasoning, rather than like are you good at it. So these findings suggest maybe there's not merely one psychological recipe for equitable and effective altruism, but perhaps a plurality. The minds of these two exceptionally altruistic groups are largely distinct from the general population, but also from each other. And they're distinct in ways that suggest that empathy and reasoning might not be competing forces in the pro-social context, but maybe complementary or supplementary forces that boost rather than inhibit equity and effectiveness. So I was interested in answering a question to get at this a little bit further, like specifically, do differences in empathy and reasoning within these populations predict differences in the prioritization of equity and effectiveness on those host of measures I showed first? So I'll start with reasoning ability, and I'm going to throw up like correlation heat maps. And in these figures, the darker red means stronger positive relationships. Darker blue means stronger negative relationships. And then the stars communicate significance. But keep in mind that the sample size, particularly among organ donors, was quite small. I want a larger sample of organ donors. There just aren't too many of them, people who have like done this while they're alive, cut an organ out of their body for somebody who's an absolute stranger, and they have no hope to meet. But I will want more data on them at some point to get to the bottom of what's going on here. So in line with perspectives on the primacy of reasoning as a motivator for effective and equitable altruism, we find that greater reasoning ability is associated with greater prioritization of pro-social equity and effectiveness across the three samples. And then the red stuff is positive relationships. And it's noteworthy, though, that these associations were strongest among effective altruists on the left here, whose guiding ideological framework places a lot of emphasis on pro-social reasoning. But the associations are nonetheless observed for the most part across the three populations. But should we be downregulating empathy and affect in our decisions to help others if we want to do this effectively and equitably? So in contrast to the perspective that empathy necessarily hinders effective resource allocations for most of the pro-social outcomes, in both effective altruists, organ donors, and controls, those with greater empathic and affective ability reported greater altruistic equity and effectiveness. And so they prioritize the impactful causes to a greater extent than less impactful causes. They placed emphasis on distant others when those causes were more impactful, and they were more expansive overall when they had greater empathic ability. And you see this is true across all three populations. But what I found interesting is that it's like especially true again for effective altruists who really put forward this narrative that reasoning is what's driving their effective and equitable altruistic behaviors. You see those relationships with empathic ability are strongest among effective altruists. So generally speaking, ability and reasoning and empathy, maybe not countervailing forces, but rather both might be associated with greater equity and effectiveness across these samples of real-world altruists and typical adults. And in many cases, we found that these effects are additive, but I want to highlight a few where we found that they interact. So in some cases, particularly among the altruistic samples, we find that greater empathy or reasoning can make deficits in the alternative, can make up for deficits in the alternative capacity. And we found that this is the case for like behavioral donations to effective causes in effective altruists, and for the moral judgments among organ donors, moral judgments of effective prioritization. And then in other cases, like those shown here, greater reasoning skills and empathic ability yielded their strongest effects on prosociality when the alternative capacity was also high. So you see this for like the overall percentage of income donated by effective altruists, and also for the prioritization of equity and effectiveness in altruistic decisions in controls. So in these cases, the pro-social benefits in empathy and reasoning depend upon the alternative capacity also being high. You only see empathy or reasoning show its greatest effect on choosing like more effective options and more equitable options when both of them are working in tandem. All right, so to recap one last time, two separate populations of real-world altruists show robust pro-social profiles and largely align in prioritizing altruistic equity and effectiveness. And the psychological features that are amplified in these two populations are distinct. Organ donors have greater empathic ability than controls. Effective altruists generally show enrichments in reasoning. And these findings suggest that there's not merely one psychological recipe for equitable and effective altruism, but maybe a plurality. The minds of these two groups of altruists are largely distinct from the general population, but also from each other. But regardless of differences in baseline capacities and empathic ability and reasoning ability among these three groups, rather than representing competing forces, empathy and reasoning are both positively associated with prioritizing equity and effectiveness in altruism. And this effect is sometimes additive and at other times multiplicative, such that empathy and reasoning can at times supplement for lower levels in the alternative capacity and at other times amplify each other's effects. I only talked about the empathy and reasoning stuff, but I collected like a whole lot of data from these three populations because it was a whole pain in the ass to do it. So I thought I would get a huge battery. So I'd be willing to talk about those findings with people if they're interested at some point. But like just to preview, in addition to empathy and reasoning, I also measured like moral beliefs and values and social attitudes among the three samples and look at how those differ and also predict differences in altruistic equity and effectiveness. So with respect to the moral beliefs, like just some of the interesting things is that like I found the altruistic samples reported more equitable and expansive moral circles relative to controls. That didn't shock me too much. They endorsed like pro-social utilitarian ethics to a greater extent. Effective altruists endorsed instrumental harm, which kind of interested me. But the thing that shocked me the most was that like in the altruistic populations, I'm supposed to be putting this up here, group loyalty also was predicting greater altruistic equity and effectiveness and was enriched in both of the two altruistic populations, which like kind of goes against like my intuitions there. And I think a lot of the literature. The most amplified social attitudes among EAs and organ donors were identification with all of humanity and love for humanity, which I also kind of found interesting for effective altruists because I sent Peter Singer an email at one point, and like this work was funded by the John Templeton Foundation, and we like motivated it based on like universal love. Peter Singer's like, well, effective altruists aren't really that interested in love. But the data seem to show that they are. And that seems to be like the strongest predictor for social attitudes of their altruistic behavior. And then there are a bunch of new like avenues that I'd love to go after going forward. I want to do like experimental research, targeting reasoning and empathy to see if I could like test causal pathways here. And looking at like situational empathy and reasoning in the context of when people are making decisions. So this is a first pass, but I think there's like a lot of work to be done here, and I think it's pretty neat. So I'll leave like, oh yeah, like also what are the social consequences? Like do effective altruists and extraordinary altruists like experience impoverished social relationships with those who are close? So they seem to like have this expansive concern for all humans, but does that come with consequences for social relationships with close others? I have those data. I haven't analyzed them yet. But if anybody's interested, talk to me in like a couple of weeks. I'll probably have it done. And I want to like use these data to test interventions. So all of this aside, what we learn here is that whether you see suffering in a shallow pond or you become aware of its existence on the other side of the world, there's probably value in reasoning how we can maximize welfare most effectively. But exceptional altruists who prioritize effectiveness and help distant strangers rely not upon reasoning alone, but empathy as well. So in response to arguments to downregulate empathy, I think this could possibly deprive us of a critical capacity that drives impartial altruism in the most pro-social populations and could probably be harnessed to do so in the rest of us if it is a societal goal. Thank you guys for listening to me ramble on there a little bit at the end, but yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you to all of these people who were super instrumental in the research. And thank you to Daryl and for organizing this and JTF. And so the data are like currently being written up. I have a paper in ticks that sets up some of these ideas. And then if you're interested in some of the other work I do, my website is there. And I do a lot of work with STEOs. Thank you, guys. I feel like we're low on time right now.
Yeah, so we may have, let's see, so we are adapting on the fly. So we may have time for, I guess I'll take host prerogative and ask one question. Then maybe we'll have time for like 5 minutes if the three speakers who just talked wanted to rip off each other a little bit.
That'd be great, yeah.
Minutes, and then we'll turn to our Zoom guests for the remainder of the hour. I guess one question that I had about your broader work, and I've asked a version of this question to you before, I think, is your measures of empathicability. I mean, especially because you're pushing back on certain kinds of narratives about empathy deficits. To what extent do you think they're capturing empathetic ability versus a more propensity or willingness to engage in empathy in certain situations?
Right. So should I have the mic? Yeah, I think the measures more clearly measure ability more so than tendencies to engage in empathy in the context of pro-social behavior, and whether or not maybe people are willing to select to engage in it even when it could be personally distressing. So this is something I'm really interested in going after, and I think it's really important that maybe even in the context of like cost to oneself, when empathy might feel kind of shitty to engage in, maybe we're still some people, possibly organ donors, I would think more likely, possibly even effective altruists are more likely to engage in it, even when it comes at a cost to themselves. But the measures I used were more about ability, and I mean, it seems that like in general, these people are way more willing to engage in costly behavior for the benefit of others, whether that it extends to like internal psychological resources. I'm not sure, but I definitely want to go after it.